Keir Starmer. This constant fact that he harks on about being chief prosecutor. He's not, he's called Director of Public Prosecutions. But chief prosecutor, what does it make him sound like? It makes him sound like a figure out of Stalin's Russia. In Starmer's eyes, he is clearly of impeccable character. He is always right.
How do you rate Keir Starmer's first 4 months as Prime Minister?
Well, the opinion polls tell us, don't they? They have plummeted in a way that looks a bit like an alpine avalanche. He's literally fallen off a cliff. I think there are very real reasons for this. When you're looking at this kind of thing, you always look, well, has there been anybody like this before? I think the answer is one very obvious figure, and that is Theresa May. That she has the same sort of rigidity, the same sort of strange sense. She always called it public service. He constantly goes on about this. She even used a similar phrase, which was strong and stable. So here is somebody, in both cases, both May and Starmer, who have a peculiar rigidity in a job which actually demands, yes, at times you have to be immensely firm, but you have to have something tactile. You have to have fingers that can sense, a nose that can smell, eyes that can see. These are people who simply don't have that. And the public understands it. They feel a sense of rigidity, alienation, something strange. Both of them are strange people.
It's funny you talk about Theresa May. I mean, she says that she's woke. She politically is probably very close to Keir Starmer. And both of those figures, we've only seen 4 months from Starmer, to be fair to him, but you could accuse both of them of being politically incompetent.
No political sense whatever. Can we understand again, the right? We've talked about character. We've talked about that peculiar personal rigidity, the strange fact that both of them tend to reuse phrases. And Starmer's quite extraordinary. He's like a kind of speak your weight machine. What are they? We have working people. We have dear me. I've heard them so often. My father is a toolmaker. All these phrases constantly recurring, almost as though it's a kind of computer. It's almost like I've used an old-fashioned phrase, a speak your weight machine. He's a kind of AI, but he's not. AI would do it very, very much better. Very much better, because Starmer is something different. I made the comparison of character to Theresa May. Starmer's something completely different. He's our first totally non-political Prime Minister. He embodies something, I think, completely new in British politics that we've never seen before, and we're already realising just how dreadful it is. What Starmer is the incarnation of all the fundamental changes that have taken place in our constitution, a kind of behind-the-scenes revolution since Blair. Starmer has a real set of values. He believes in the rules. Theresa May believed in the rules, but Starmer's are a much more structured, much more focused set of rules. He believes in this thing called the rule of law. And he sees the rule of law as exactly what it sounds like, a set of rules, which is a kind of how you do it book. And in other words, he is a very rigid, very narrow-minded, very limited sort of lawyer. And again, it's worth looking at decisions that he's taken. There are two things that really characterize this rule of law. At home, it's essentially centered on the idea of human rights. He was a human rights lawyer. And what that means essentially, and this is this extraordinary thing, what we need to understand, it means that human rights, you might think, they're your rights and my rights. Well, that's how they began. But in the period from the institution of the conventions, the United Nations, the European, into their adaptation and their adoption into formal law, they underwent a series of extraordinary changes. They began as protecting you and me against the state. They're then stood on their head, and they're designed to protect minorities. And the only way you can protect minorities against wicked people like you and me, who were both male and white, is actually if you turn the weight of the state onto the majority. You see what I'm getting at? In other words, you have this strange view that fundamentally you disapprove of the majority of your population. And the majority of the population can sense it. So you have this inverted view of democracy. Democracy used to be, call me old-fashioned, majority rule. But now it's been stood on its head, and it prioritizes minorities. So the very doctrines of human rights are leading to this extraordinary situation where there is the literal two-tier, the two-tier in policing, the two-tier in style, the two-tier in taxation. Because again, you've got a very clear sense in this, what's good and what's bad. He talks about working people. He doesn't really believe it. This is why the definition won't stack up. He believes public sector good, private sector bad, fundamentally. Now, this, of course, is the economics of the madhouse, because the only thing that sustains the public sector is the economic activity of the private sector. Wealth cannot be generated by the public sector. It can only be generated by the private sector. So there is this strange set of mismatches at home. Now abroad, it's even stranger. What the rule of law means abroad is international law, this strange, weird concept, which is basically anchored to the dying structures of the United Nations. And the result is, of course, if you anchor your values to that, you do the surrender of the Chagos Islands. You have no sense of a national interest any more than you have a sense of the genuine interest of the majority of the population. Instead, everything is subordinated to what? What have we heard about the whole of the time? We want to be the world's leader in climate change, even if it wrecks our industry. We want to give the Chagos Islands back, even if it represents, not only a potential handover to China, which is in the offing, but actually a major strategic defeat. It's why, again, on the whole business of reparations for slavery at the Commonwealth Conference, he had no language with which he could resist the claims that were being thrown at him. In other words, this is a prime minister and it's unique in British history, he is a genuine first, and we need to get this point over, who doesn't actually believe in Britain, doesn't actually believe in the majority of the British people, has no feel for them, and has no sense of the national interest. How can you run a country?
I want to ask more about his character. Do you think that he is a mean-spirited person? Some people say that Theresa May, she believed in public service and she was ultimately, at heart, a good person. A lot of people would disagree with that. But do you think that Starmer is mean-spirited? Where does he sit morally?
It's very difficult to say, because this is a man who advertises the fact that he has no inner life. When he's interviewed, he says, effectively says, I haven't read a book. I don't have a favourite piece of poetry. So you cannot have a moral life if you have no experience of literature, if you've got no experience of the romantic poems of life, love, loss, death, all of those things. So here is somebody who seems to have an extraordinarily mechanistic, it's a very, very mechanistic view. Now, if we're going to look at how this actually works out in practice, I think it turns into something deeply inhuman and unhumane. He's very fond, isn't he, of saying, I find it easy to be ruthless. Look at the way Sue Gray was dumped. Here is somebody, remember what the relationship with Starmer has done to Sue Gray's career, and I have no personal feelings for Sue Gray, whatever. What he's done to her career is to destroy her entire reputation. That's to say, here was a woman who was an exemplary civil servant, who was the head of propriety and ethics, was the kind of disciplinary force within the Cabinet Office. He, or somebody on his behalf, seduces her politically. She compromises the integrity of herself and the civil service. She calls, by the becoming Chief of Staff to start Keir Starmer, she calls her entire investigation of Partygate, Kate Gate, into question. And then what happens? She's thrown away like a soiled tissue. That is an astonishing act. Can I then become much more personal? I've talked about this before. Back at the time of my cancellation 4 years ago, at the height of the mania of Black Lives Matter, when Starmer again, uniquely amongst leading politicians, took the knee, bowed, in other words, to the minority, despite the violence, despite the shocking scenes in London, despite the fact that Churchill's statue, of all things, had to be protected against vandalism. By the way, there was no coming down hard on the rioters at that point, was there? Because, of course, he believes in this two-tier world. Anyway, I was part of that moment of national hysteria. The national hysteria sort of played out. I was cancelled at the end, and dear old Darren Grimes at the end of June, beginning of July. A few months later, I think it was in September, some little detective constable in the Met Police, and he was a leading figure in the whatever it's called, the Black Police Officers Association, or whatever it was, decided that Grimes and I were guilty, or at least deserved investigation, under, I think it's Section 6 of the Public Order Act, which carries a term of imprisonment of up to 6 years. Everybody, including my enemies, laughed their heads off. The Times, which had been deeply hostile, wrote a third editorial and said, it's ridiculous to prosecute Starkey, but let him retire in disgrace. The full pompous mode of the Times at its most sort of Boris Johnson-like bloviating. One public figure said that he thought the prosecution made sense. It was Keir Starmer. This constant fact that he harks on about being chief prosecutor. He's not, he's called Director of Public Prosecutions. But chief prosecutor, what does it make him sound like? It makes him sound like a figure out of Stalin's Russia or the French Revolution, the terrible figure of Fouquier-Tinville, the man who sends thousands to hideous deaths. I'm afraid you can see him doing it. And, this is the problem. Again, he is the embodiment of a certain woke. There is, in Starmer's eyes, and this again is something he shares with May, he is clearly of impeccable character. He is always right. There is no possibility that he's wrong because he's followed the rules. You see, this is why he handled, what do we call it, Allygate, or whatever it was, Alligator, why he handled Allygate so badly, because he thought he'd followed the rules. So there was this, anybody with 2 seconds of nous would have known exactly what you to do. Hands up, yes, terrible mistake, but of course, I paid it all off, I've given it all back, this will never ever happen again, and, Ali will depart into outer darkness. Instead, what did he do? He argues about it, he justifies it, and then finally, the worst possible thing, listen to this one, Steve, he repays £6,000 worth. Obviously, he'd run a calculator over it. He'd worked out exactly how much he'd received after being Prime Minister rather than before Prime Minister. I mean, do you see what I mean? There is something really very odd about this, isn't there? I mean, this is not the kind of behaviour of an ordinary person, let alone an ordinary politician. So we're dealing with a very odd figure, but he's a product, as I said, of this series of extraordinary changes which have happened to Britain and much of the rest of the world, the Western world, but I think particularly intensively here in the last 30 years. And we can see, of course, how much they contradict what almost all the rest of us regard as simply normal behaviour.
I want to broaden out the discussion to other Labour Party figures. I'm glad you say that he's a product. I think he's not unique in that sense.
No, I agree completely. Yeah.
So let's talk about the cabinet. And, it's interesting, again, you talk about the fact Starmer feels that he followed the rules when he accepted all of those donations, therefore, morally and everything, it's fine. And you have this view from Labour Party.
You see, I don't think the thought morally really comes into his mind. Legally, he thinks exclusively in legal criteria. Starmer is like a walking small print at the end of, a phone contract. He's all those pages you don't read.
More broadly, is his cabinet a cabinet of talent? Are we seeing a kind of Tony Blair style, fantastic...
Oh, come on. Oh, come on. Yeah. Are there giants like Gordon Brown? Is there a Demosthenes like Jack Straw? There were some reasonably talented people in Blair's cabinet. There's no doubt about that. No, I think is the answer. There are some people who think they're bright, like Wes Streeting. But again, you see, even Wes, although he can almost speak human, and it's very interesting, he hasn't quite, there is a certain sense there is actually a human being there. He is part of this essentially woke, which of course combines self-righteousness on the one hand with an extraordinary rigidity and suppressed violence on the other. Tweets that Wes Streeting wrote back in 2009 are coming out, talking about smashing people with baseball bats. Now, we've seen it again, haven't we, with the famous MP for Rotherham and all the rest of it. And that there is a violence about all of this. Which again, we've seen it before in English history. There's this kind of rigidity, this kind of stiffed backness, this same kind of aggression in the name of what they think of as a sort of virtue, is a strong characteristic of Puritanism. And we did have a Puritan revolution, which behaved in many ways very much as they are behaving. Again, this intense concern with the behaviour of others, with a certain indifference to the behaviour of oneself. But more generally, of course, they all talk in platitudes. There is a sense, really, that, and this again, I'm trying to get my head around it because it's difficult to explain, but it needs explaining. These are people who have never ever done anything real under any circumstances. They dwell, again, in one of the very strange features of woke. It's a world of simply words, of rigidly deployed phrases and words. You see this most clearly, of course, with the whole belief. You will remember Starmer's profound difficulty in defining a woman. You will remember, I think, was it David Lammy who was persuaded that with a little bit of chemical help, a chap could grow a cervix, I seem to remember. All of this is to do with a kind of a quality of magical thinking. In other words, if I say I am a woman, I am a woman. Whatever my chromosomes are, whatever my external and internal sexual characteristics are, I am a woman. Which again, you see, it's religious. It's a bit like the Catholic Mass. It's a form of transubstantiation, the belief that once you've uttered the words of consecration over the elements of the Mass, they do actually, in some way, the bread and the wine actually becomes flesh and blood. And it's the same way, isn't it, if you actually look at everything they're doing. This constant repetition, we're devoted to growth. They seem to think that you can bring about growth by talking about it, because every single thing that they have actually done is guaranteed not to produce growth. If you inflate public sector wages, if you introduce, if you send the minimum wage, rocketing up. If you introduce, of all things, as they appear to be doing, a heightened employment tax, because employers' national insurance is no more than a tax on employment. If you introduce all of these new regulations that will protect trade unions, will enforce yet more, as it were, wokery and so-called equality in the workplace, all of these things are more or less guaranteed to make sure growth won't happen. Instead, you talk about it. It's magical. I mean, these people they're guilty of not guilty, they perform magical thinking. They think, as I said, simply by talking about something, it happens. It's quite clear that again, this is the government, what is it, 5 goals, that simply by talking about things, simply by setting up a committee, simply by saying that we want to be, whatever it is, the world's green energy superpower, suddenly these things happen. They don't. There's a real world. They have absolutely no sense of it at all. And as I said, I think a mindset that actually excludes it. There is no sense that they can really understand evidence. I mean, there's never been a budget like it. I mean, do you remember you're young enough, you're old enough just to remember when leaking the details of a budget was a completely sackable offence. I mean, famously, in the Attlee government, when his first Chancellor of the Exchequer actually speaks, I think it to the press, or is reported in the press, half an hour before he gave the budget speech, Hugh Dalton is sacked. We have had this extraordinary performance in which there's been this kind of dance of the 7 veils. I mean, it's been literally a sense of, oh, we thought that was a good idea. Now, is it really a good idea to transfer the whole burden of this heightened taxation onto people who can quite easily move out of Britain? Oh, they're going to move out of Britain. Do you know, we'd never thought of that. Do you see what I mean when I call it magical thinking?
I want to ask about the backlash to Keir Starmer's government. We've already seen riots to do with immigration. As you mentioned at the beginning of this interview, his opinion poll ratings have plummeted. Do you think that he can survive the next 5 years? Do you think that more Labour voters will regret voting for Starmer? And do you think we'll see more protests, riots? What kind of things can we expect over the next 5 years with such an unpopular figure?
I think it's important that we actually look clearly at what the formal position is first, and then what might happen. The formal position is that Starmer is absolutely guaranteed 5 years by the fluke that he has this enormous majority in the House of Commons. The only requirement for a Prime Minister is that he commands a majority in the House of Commons. So, unless the Labour Party splits, which it is just possible that it might, because again he is hopeless at party management. Whereas Angela Rayner is famously the only Secretary of State to have left school with more children than O levels, but she's human. This is her profound strength. She's human. She can take a joke. She may indeed be a joke. She can laugh at herself. She can enjoy herself. And she has a gut feeling for what both the old and the new Labour Party is about. So then she can play those games. He can't. So there is a very real possibility of a series of splits. Again, there is the thing that nobody wants to talk about, but we're seeing rising sectarianism. It's quite clear that pressure could mount. It could mount very easily. But we've then got to ask, how is it that somebody is so secure when they only commanded, whatever it was, 30-odd% in the actual poll, and only 1 in 5 voters, because it was the second lowest turnout in the general election since the beginning of democracy. How can you hold that position? You can hold it only by one thing, Steve, and it's called constitutional convention. In the same way that, as we saw, the complete contrast with, say, the last transfer of power in America, or likely the current transfer of power, again, the kind of mess that you see in France at the moment, you saw the absolute seamlessness as Rishi moves out and Starmer moves in. That is the great strength of the old British Constitution. But this is the paradox. Starmer is utterly contemptuous of it. The Labour Party is contemptuous of it. The first thing they begin to do is to tinker with Parliament, the removal of the rump of the hereditaries. Starmer speaks openly of being contemptuous of Parliament. We've seen the scenes in which the Speaker Hoyle upbraided the Labour Party for its contempt of Parliament. Starmer has no regard for the Constitution. He has no regard for the conventions that actually account for our peaceful political life. Now, this is profoundly dangerous because he will find that it's only those conventions that keep him in power. So do you see what I mean? He's actually kicking away the supports that should be there, that should sustain him. I think we've also got to look at something else. It is, I think, certain there will be a major financial crisis. The extraordinary constant jacking up of debt. We're needing, in the hundreds of billions of gilt sales, of government debt sales every year. We're sending the figure up continuously. Now, America can get away with it. At least it can get away with it for the moment, because America is the world reserve currency, or it's a reserve currency of roughly about 1/2 of the world, as Russia and China and India and Brazil and South Africa are going off in a different direction. We can't. We cannot do that. There are already disturbing signs of movement on the bond markets. So I think it's very likely, my guess is it's very likely, we will see, first of all, a major financial crisis. At which point the government cannot continue stuffing its paymasters, the trade unions of the public sector, with gold. I think, therefore, that the best way of looking at this, I always say this, is to look at it historically. We are rerunning the 1970s. This is 1974. Edward Heath has been defeated. Harold Wilson has taken over. You immediately jack up tax rates, Dennis Healey. You immediately start throwing money at your own people. And within 2 years, you have the IMF in. And then, of course, in 1979, you have exactly what you talk about, major disorder, the breakdown of literally both public order and public decency, bodies unburied, rubbish uncollected. I remember it vividly. Now, I can see another element, of course, which is sectarian violence. We are a whisker away. We have, of course, because our police force, thank heavens, and it's one of the great things, again, the old conventions. Why aren't our police regularly armed? They're virtually unique in the world in not being regularly armed. When I was a boy, it was the most shocking experience of my life when I went to France, and I think it was 1958, and the whole period of the Algerian crisis and the rise of de Gaulle. And there were police surrounding the Parliament building with the Palais Bourbon with submachine guns. I'd never seen any of that. I was appalled. I was horrified. Now, again, what we're doing is, with not simply the fact that we have a highly diverse multicultural population, but the fact that we are, and again, it's partly a product of the Human Rights Act. It's partly a product of the Equalities Act. It's partly a product of this strange bias to minorities. We are actively encouraging the formation of what really amount to sub-states. When the police say, and we saw it very clearly in the riots, that they're negotiating with community leaders, they're in fact conceding semi-separate status. And as we saw, these groups are perfectly capable of turning out with weapons. Fortunately, at that point, it was mainly sticks. it could easily turn into something worse. But we've seen something else which we haven't talked about, the whole Tommy Robinson episode. If you want to understand Tommy Robinson, if you want to understand the people that turned out a day or two ago in London, they are what is sort of the English community. And Robinson is sort of the community leader. He's the equivalent of the imam, right? And his followers behaved rather well this time round. I can see circumstances when perhaps they weren't. And you see, there's another problem. We haven't incorporated any of this properly into our mainstream politics. If you cross the Atlantic, you can see, particularly Trump, is able to absorb this into mainstream politics. Here, even Reform has gone, we couldn't possibly touch that. And so there's a terrible risk of, I suppose, a two-tier politics. That's to say, what passes for formal politics in the House, and I'm afraid a Weimar-style clash of force in the streets. Now, I'm not predicting that. I'm saying it could happen. And there are all too many signs, and we have, of course, a police force which is manifestly incapable of dealing with it. And just taking that point through, remember, one of the most interesting things about Margaret Thatcher was she understood the reality of power. She did not take on the miners until two things had happened. She'd stockpiled coal in the power stations to make sure power wasn't going to go off, and she stuffed the mouth of the police force with gold. And what has Starmer done instead? He has, of course, because of this legalistic basis of the whole thing, in the Blake case, in the Carber case, he has seriously infuriated the only properly armed section of the police force. In other words, he has deliberately, as it were, cut from under himself what may well be the only protection of public order. Again, it is just this extraordinary inability to deal with the real world.
It's interesting you talk about Reform not going as far as perhaps they could do. I know a lot of people criticised Nigel Farage for an interview that I did with him where I asked him about would he support mass deportations, which is a very popular policy in the United States. And there are a lot of illegal immigrants in Britain, and many people would argue they should all be deported. They came here illegally. Nigel refused to support that for his own reasons. I just wonder whether you think that too many Conservatives, both in Reform and in the Conservative Party, live in this kind of libertarian Thatcher world of the 80s where Britain was fairly homogenous and we didn't live in this more divided multicultural society that we live in today. And whether Conservatives across the board are too obsessed with this libertarian, liberal economic perspective of free trade, free movement, and so on, rather than the social conservative aspect that perhaps has been lost behind.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the problem is, again, we tend to fight the last war, don't we? And it's perfectly clear that in some ways we do need to revive a kind of Thatcherite approach to public financial policy, this utter incontinence with money on both sides. Remember, all that's happening now is really that we're putting the final icing on the cake of 14 years of mismanagement. And there's we have Jeremy Hunt making a great deal of fuss, but what's going on isn't all that different from what they were doing. But once again, let's look back. In 1974, you have this extraordinary, genuine shift in conservatism. From the period of 1945, the Attlee's victory, right up to 1974 and Edward Heath, the Conservative Party, without really thinking about it very much, had completely bought in to all the things that the Attlee government had done. It had bought into nationalisation. It had bought into prices and incomes policies to try to control inflation. It had bought into extraordinary privileges for trade unions and of course the NHS and gigantic ugly council house building which simply built the slums of the not very distant future. It had done all of that. And then in 1974 there is that moment in which one man, and it really is one man, Sir Keith Joseph, wakens up and says, gosh, we called ourselves, this is after the defeat, we called ourselves Conservative, but we weren't. I was a member of a government that called itself Conservative. It didn't do any conservative things. And that's the point at which Thatcherism is invented. The idea that the cure-all is the free market economy. But of course, that's not, and it was necessary. What Thatcher did was necessary. How she did it, and the failure, as it were, properly to cope with the consequences of it, is a very, very different matter. The basic approach, at least in terms of bringing inflation under control, in terms of dealing with the nationalised industries, in terms of dealing with overweening trade union power, all these things were right. But of course, the world has changed again. What happened under Blair was something completely different. Margaret Thatcher herself says in 2002, Tony Blair is, my proudest achievement, because you'll remember Mandelson. They were terribly easy about people being filthy rich. Free market economics had triumphed, but something very different happened. Under Blair, there was a complete quiet revolution in which the whole structure of our politics was transformed, the whole structure of how we do things. And you can summarize it in one very, very simple way. You pulled all power away from Parliament, because Parliament is the only bit of the Constitution where there is direct popular input. And instead, you transferred it to every other kind of body. You transferred it to the Bank of England. The key element is the interest rates. The government has absolutely no control over it. Now, it wouldn't matter if the Bank of England had handled it well. The record of the Bank of England since 2010, like the record of all the central banks, is a disgrace and a scandal. And of course, culminating in COVID. I mean, the whole business of rock-bottom interest rates, of quantitative easing, which is, a fancy word for printing money, disgraceful. So you see it, you franchise out policy to this whole series of quangos, the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, the Climate Change Committee, English Nature, and so on. And these control enormous aspects of government policy. We saw it culminating during COVID, when we were really governed by SAGE. We were governed by a committee of mad scientists who had, of course, only one concern: to stop anybody dying under any circumstances of COVID. It didn't matter what else they died from. It didn't matter if the country went bankrupt. It didn't matter if nobody got any education. It didn't matter if people couldn't mourn. Didn't matter if people couldn't celebrate births. Just stop COVID. And of course, that's typical of these single issue committees. So we created this series of single issue committees which are completely unamenable to any form of democratic control. And then the whole legal system is stood on its head. The theory of the English, Anglo-British, call it that, constitution is that Parliament, that's the body that you and me elect, is sovereign. This was literally turned on its head by the creation of the Supreme Court, by the demotion of the position of the Lord Chancellor, and the invention of this strange thing called the rule of law. And what the rule of law means is the rule of lawyers. We transferred power from our elected representatives to unelected judges. Now, they have a bit of this in America, but judges are elected, and the judges of the Supreme Court are subject to political scrutiny by the Senate. We have absolutely no equivalent here. So everywhere you look, there was this inversion of what had gone before, this deliberate anti-democratization. Now, that's where we are now. And it cuts even more deeply, of course, because all these bodies that were set up, the Quangos, and the legal profession, the civil service, the universities, all now are part of this sort of elite. They're a new ruling class. They're a new ruling class with a new set of values. Michael Gove, in one of his important good contributions to politics, calls it the blob. There are about 5,000. There are about 5 million of them. And the NHS and whatever. And it's clear they hold a radically different set of values from everybody else. And this is the added problem with all of this, because we talk about woke as though it was a cultural problem. Well, it is a cultural problem. As you know, it's an application of a biblical text, the Magnificat. He shall put down the mighty from their seats. So racism is simply white people daring to say that, they invented modernity, daring to say that there's a qualitative difference between the achievements of, black civilization and what's happened in the West. But you see, look at it. That fits perfectly with the new legal doctrine of human rights, which prioritizes minorities. And you have judges who are bought into this. So you've got this entire complex. The way I would describe it, and Neil Ferguson has said the same, we now have a structure of government that is very much like Soviet Russia in its last days. You've got this huge, overblown public sector, and the thing that Starmer calls the public service, which is specially privileged, which has enhanced pension. I mean, have you seen the extraordinary business? Not only is Starmer's pension specially protected by an act of parliament, but all the things that are going to damage the pensions of people in the private sector, the public sector is going to be protected against. I mean, it's a blatant two-tier. So what the Conservative Party has got to do is to recognise what has happened. It's got to understand that exactly back in 1974, what was needed was to undo the economic insanity of socialism. It's now got to undo something else. It's got to undo a deliberate and complete perversion of our Constitution, which is designed to take away power from our elected representatives. And I'm actually writing to this effect. Very quickly, what the Conservative Party should be doing is declaring that when it's elected, and I think it has a very good chance of being elected, bearing in mind all the things we're saying about Starmer's unpopularity, the extraordinary volatility of the electorate, it should commit itself to a gigantic act of repeal, to an undoing of what the Blair government did and what itself did. Because again, in just the same way that the Conservative governments of Macmillan and Heath and so on simply continued with all the foolish things that had been done under the Labour government of Attlee and so on. Similarly, from 2010 onwards, you got extra blocks put into this dreadful structure, the Office of Budget Responsibility, which, moving in cahoots with the Bank of England, means that the Chancellor of the Exchequer takes the blame but can't actually control the amount of taxation that's needed. You do even worse things. Theresa May, again, we're going back to her, with the Act of 2015, which actually legislates the target of net zero of 2050. This is why judges, it's unbelievable, Stephen, judges can actually rule on the policy of extracting fossil fuels. Even madder is what's happened with the Equalities Act. Do you know the Equalities Act incorporates the Marxist labour theory of value? Which there are three equations, which is how judges rule on pay rates. I mean, this is worse than the prices and incomes policies of the post-war period. Judges rule on whether women are paid appropriately as against men. Now, it's the only thing that can determine that is the market. If you actually believe that there is some sort of proper balance to be struck, you believe in again, as I said, the idea that labour has got an intrinsic value. But it's the consequences. The judges have bankrupted Birmingham. They bankrupted the second largest authority in the country. They are about to bankrupt next, and they will go through the entire retail sector on these grounds. It is madness. The Conservative Party has got to recognise this. It's got to say, we will undo this. We will repeal the independence of the Bank of England. We will remove the Office of Budget Responsibility. We will cut the Supreme Court down to size. We will, again, as the only person showing any sign of this, of course, is Robert Jenrick. As Robert Jenrick is saying, we've got to get rid of the incorporation of the European Convention on Human Rights into British law. We must undo the Equality Act. There's got to be a great sweeping away, but it's got to be presented in terms that people will understand. This is the real taking back control. Brexit was only the beginning, and the fact that there wasn't this control taken back domestically is why it failed.
Let me ask a quick question, about Robert Jenrick. That was absolutely fascinating, and I want to ask about the leadership contest. I want to make a few points and then you can react. So you said that in 1974 this was the great turnaround for the Conservative Party at the time, with Keith Joseph and Margaret Thatcher. But in 1958, Enoch Powell famously resigned as a Treasury Minister along with the Chancellor because of what he saw as this crazy prices and incomes policy, where the government was literally setting the price of certain goods and incomes and so on.
Everybody's.
Right. So Enoch Powell was someone who actually foresaw this, and he was talking both about immigration, the social conservative side of things, and the economic liberalism, which is fascinating. And he has been invoked in this leadership contest by his official biographer, Simon Heffer. The book is, fantastic. I think, like a Roman, I forget what it's called, but it's a very good book. And he says that Enoch Powell would vote for Kemi Badenoch. I want you to react to that. And furthermore, just one other point about Kemi Badenoch. A lot of her supporters, a lot of conservative commentators have said that because she is black, because she comes from Africa, she was from Nigeria, she was born in London but grew up much of her time in Nigeria. Because of this, it means that the Labour Party and the left won't be able to criticise the Conservatives as being racist, and therefore this is a fantastic advantage for electing Kemi Badenoch. So can you react to, first of all, on Enoch Powell, whether he would vote for her, and second of all, on the fact that she's black, she's from Africa, or she was raised in Nigeria, that's a great advantage for her.
The first point first. I think Simon was absolutely wrong, well though he knows Enoch Powell. Powell was a man of ruthless logic. He was also a man of extraordinary, despite his terrible end, in other words, the end of his political career, he was a man of remarkable, I think, political skill and logic. I think what he would say about Badenoch was he'd do two things. He'd look at what she's saying, and he'd say, this is really quite an interesting analysis. What she's doing, she's looking essentially at the cultural phenomena. She's commissioned a very interesting, very serious academic report, which points out, I've been talking about the public sector on the one hand, the new, what in Soviet Russia used to be called the nomenklatura, this privileged group of state employees with their own special ethic, and of course the Labour Party, and Starmer in particular, being the quintessence of them, being the absolute concentrated essence. So what we have with Starmer is the government of the blob, by the blob, for the blob. And on the other hand, the rest of us in the private sector who make our living in the dirty old-fashioned way and are now having this huge increased burden of taxation thrust upon us, essentially to privilege the public sector. That's fine. She points out that there's a radical value divide between the two, one woke, the other unwoke. But she doesn't draw a single political conclusion. Now, maybe in the 1970s there was a bit of time. There isn't time now because there's reform. Reform ready to snap and bite, and much further down the road, although it's not yet, as I said, fully grasped the populist nettle, and we'll talk about that populist, that very word, populist, in a moment. It seems to me immediately what Power would say is, you haven't thought it through. That absolute cut logic that the man had, Jenrick hasn't fully thought it through either, but he's much further down the road. He has a series of concrete policy prescriptions. He also recognises firmly that the ground that has been so successfully taken over by reform has to be repossessed. And he said a series of things that no mainstream politician has dared to say, I would say, since the days of Enoch Powell. He has actually said that those who were responsible for the glossing over of the Rotherham child abuse scandal, civil servants and policemen, there shouldn't just be an inquiry, they should be dismissed and if need be go to jail. Now, this is language which is Power-like in its force and the strength of its logic. So that's that. It's sort of really an answer to both questions in a sense, isn't it?
Well, I just think it's interesting that so many people are focusing on her identity.
Oh, sorry, the identity business. I attached so little importance to it, I'd forgotten it. I think it's a complete misunderstanding. On the contrary, as we saw with the treatment of Suella Braverman and Priti Patel, the left doesn't pull back. They have a special terms of denunciation. You are called, and both of them were, repeatedly, things like coconut or Oreo cookie. You're black on the outside, but you're white within. The left will not pull back for 1 second. That will not... This is... If you think that there's going to be that camouflage, think again. And the final problem with Badenoch, as I gathered, on the grounds there's nothing bad in Badenoch, as Kemi prefers to be called, is who is supporting her. The entire old guard of the party and central office are supporting her. This is, I think, probably lethal. There has to be a serious moment at which the party chooses. It cannot continue being the party of David Cameron and Theresa May. It really cannot. In retrospect, we can see the absolute catastrophe of Cameron declaring himself the heir of Blair, saying that this is the party that he wants to be welcoming to Liberals. Theresa May, with that, that staggering folly, worse than folly, calling it the nasty party. What I'm saying is the wets will probably have to go. Now, I think there are fewer of the principled wets than we tend to think. There are many people in the middle of the party who are simply there for power, as most politicians, and will shift. But there will have to be, I think, some casualties. There's a wonderful passage in Machiavelli at his best in his discourses on the Roman historian Titus Livy, in which he talks about Brutus ordering his sons who supported the defeated king of Rome to be killed. Every good politician Every good party has to have a Brutus moment, and the Conservative Party needs its Brutus moment. Again, with all his faults, Johnson did the right thing when he removed the whip. And with all Johnson's inadequacies, and they were profound, and in my view would absolutely exclude any kind of Johnson revival, there was on the key issues that absolute sense of this is where we are, like it or lump it. And the electorate understood. The electorate responded.
There's two more subjects I want to broach. I don't know how much time you've got, but maybe briefly we can talk about reparations and then we'll talk about America. So on the reparations issue, I know that Commonwealth countries are desperate to extract billions of pounds from Britain for slavery reparations. And as you said earlier, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party have been having to deal with this issue. How do you assess reparations? Should we be paying reparations to these countries?
The idea is simply absurd. You pay reparations when you're defeated in war. It's as simple as that. There is also neither a moral nor a practical case. Slavery is unique. Really? Of course it isn't. Britain uniquely guilty of it. Slavery is universal. And in terms of the only unique thing about Britain is unique and absolutely unique in that there is a moral revolution in 18th century England, and to an extent in North America, in the Puritan colonies, the New England colonies, in which there's a moral revolution in which for the first time in human history slavery is thought to be wrong. And it is acted upon, and as we know, slavery is progressively outlawed in the British Empire, and once the slave trade is finally outlawed, there's this extraordinary double thing. The slaves are freed, indeed, by paying off their owners rather than paying off them, but above all, you then embark on this spectacular, it's nearly 40 years in which a very significant part of the effort of the Royal Navy is devoted to suppressing the slave trade. Now, that is a unique record. It is a series of moral decisions that were actually taken. In terms of apologies, apologies go back to William Pitt the Younger. They go back to Prince, talking about royal apologies. One of the first acts of Prince Albert when he becomes Prince Consort is to deliver a speech in which he talks about slavery as the scourge of Africa and the disgrace of Europe. Right. So the uniqueness of Britain is that it does something about it. And then there's a final thing, which again needs thinking about, and needs thinking about seriously. It is the comparator. There were two powers who were of very great importance in the Caribbean. I'm setting aside Spain. Remember, the whole slave trade is actually controlled by Spain. It's invented by Spain, but it's the Latin American and Caribbean colonies. The reasons we know so much about it is because they keep immaculate records. They're a bit like the Nazis. The reason we can be so precise about the extent of the Holocaust is because Eichmann and his like kept good records. The Spanish were exactly the same. They keep excellent records of the number of slaves and the ships in which they sail and all the rest of it. But the other great power in the Caribbean and the richest and the most terrible of the slave colonies was held by France. It was Saint-Domingue, which is now known as Haiti. The horror of Haiti. What everybody in the Bahamas should be asked, what everybody in Jamaica should be asked is, would you like to have been Haiti? Because do you know how the Haitians got their independence from France? They had to buy it. There was an indemnity of, I forget whether it's 150 million or 200 million gold francs, which is not paid off by that wretchedly poor country until the Second World war. And the final point, Stephen, is the comparator. If you actually look at GDP per capita in Barbados or the other Caribbean islands, it is higher by a factor of 10 and more than the comparable GDP per head in the countries from which they would have come. What are we compensating them for? But you see, you cannot have these. These are the sort of things that Starmer should have been saying. He cannot say them because A, he doesn't have the knowledge, and he shows no sign of being able to grasp it. But secondly, he buys into the doctrine of woke. He buys in, essentially, into this view that all the sins in the world are the results of the white man. And it's this preposterous inversion of values. Again, he buys into the doctrines of international law. And of course, there's something deeply pathetic about Starmer in this regard. He's, as it were, nailing his colours to the mast at the moment at which the United Nations is dissolving in ignominy, in which you have, in other words, the body that is supposedly the centre of international law is dissolving in ignominy, in which you have the dreadful, the uniquely awful Secretary General Guterres doing what? Dancing attendance on China and Russia and Putin, who is actually due to be arraigned before the International Criminal Court. The complete absurdity of this structure. But he's sold on it. He's sold on woke. He's sold on human rights. He's sold on international law, so he's got no defence. And the terrible thing is, I think he may actually be forced to concede them. There's another thing that we need to say.
Well, let me just interrupt because I'm running out of time. Sorry, I do want to ask about America very quickly. America, the election. Can you just talk first of all about Kamala Harris? How do you assess her as a candidate, and also Donald Trump?
Well, Kamala Harris is absurd, isn't she? I mean, as she says herself. She actually says it. I mean, correct me, you're interested in these things. She actually said, I can't think on my feet. When she's asked, what is my weakness? She says, I can't think on my feet. I can't put a sentence together. How can you run a country? I mean, she's there, isn't she, clearly, as a result of the catastrophic miscalculation and lies of the Democratic Party in claiming that Biden was capable and was mentally sound, and the fact they left themselves no time to find anybody else. In other words, she's never been subject to any form of democratic scrutiny. I imagine she will be truly, truly terrible. And she's, of course, signed up to all the worst aspects of all the things we've been talking about, human rights and whatever, with one very important exception. America has never bought into the nonsense of international law. America is not party to most of the conventions. Again, it's very important to understand that although Kamala Harris may be signed up to all the domestic absurdity and the hugely extravagant overspending and whatever of woke and whatever, she isn't signed up to the nonsense of international law. America has been absolutely resolute. It is, despite its prominence within the United Nations, it is not a member of the, it is not signed up, signatory to the International Criminal Court. There's none of that. But I imagine she will be disastrous. And Trump is Trump. I suppose if I were in America, I would hold my nose and vote for Trump. You have a choice of two absolutely awful candidates. But equally, you have a most interestingly different lineup between them. You have on what Harris represents. Harris represents really exactly what Starmer represents. With, as I said, the exception of the international law bit. She represents this new world of human rights, diversity, inclusion, and equality, of the inversion of racial politics. It is, of course, a new apartheid, except that it's black that's good and white that's bad. She represents all of that. So, in other words, really a continuation of the existing American establishment. What we have, I think, with Trump is something completely different. The most interesting thing, first of all, Vance, his vice president, is a man, I think, of genuine flair and supreme, really, really remarkable intelligence. And then also you have the extraordinary figure of Elon Musk in the background. And Musk has talked more sensibly about the big issues than anybody I can think of for a long time. He is the one, because of course he's a brilliant businessman, he's homed in absolutely like a needle, like a power-light needle, on the two key questions. Exactly the things Powell talked about. The utter unsustainability of the levels of American public borrowing and public spending on the one hand, and on the threat to freedom of speech on the other. And he understands, in other words, what you have with Musk is somebody who actually understands and exemplifies himself why America, unlike the whole virtually of the rest of the West, and particularly and above all the disaster of Britain and the even greater disaster of continental Europe, people who say that joining the EU would actually help us economically clearly understand nothing of what's going on in France, Germany, or elsewhere. What you have with Musk is somebody who genuinely understands what needs to be done. He has been talking in words that could be taken straight from David Starkey's mouth about the need to protect the Constitution, about the need for sound money, about the need, above all, to cut back on this huge multiplicity of government offices, of directorates for this, that, and the other, all the agencies, as they call them in America, which is the equivalent of our quangos. He recognizes the fundamental problem, and I think he's the only person in America who, I'm sure the only person who recognizes it. Nobody else has spoken out so forcibly. Nobody else has such a platform. Nobody else, I think, has actually the possibility of doing something about it.
David Starkey, thank you so much for that. I really, really enjoyed that. Thank you.
A pleasure.